The Oarsman, written by Dave Aldrich and narrated by Mason Adey. The cloaked figure stood in what was once a small plaza fronting a concrete entrance to the local subway system. Now, it was a verdant glade concealing a crumbling archway, almost completely overgrown with the sprawling foliage that had turned the entire area into a veritable forest. Looking up, he read the ominous graffiti scrawled above the crest of the arch in blood-red paint. "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." He smirked. "How quaint," he quipped aloud to absolutely no one. With a disapproving shake of his head, he stepped forward and, locating one of the gaps in the vegetation blanketing the entrance, slipped inside. Emerging into a small vestibule at the top of a steep stairwell leading down into the earth, he noticed some detritus off to one side. At first, he thought it was just the remnants of a campfire, but upon closer inspection, noted a few objects he recognised. An assortment of stones painted with various runes, a couple of large candles, and several gemstones. "Pagans," he uttered disdainfully. When the plague first appeared, it had moved relatively slowly for a disease that would ultimately extinguish 3/4 of the population. But as more and more people succumbed to its relentless spread, most people had come to accept the revelation that the true source of the plague was not a biological infection, but rather a divine cleansing. The infectious idea that all of those who were morally infirm would, sooner or later, be counted amongst the afflicted quickly spread. And once it took hold, organised society collapsed just as quickly. Then, the church stepped in. Of course, some people didn't accept the church's pronouncements and governance, and some of them responded by turning to the old gods, those who had been worshipped since the days before the rise of the church. For the second time, he shook his head disapprovingly, then turned and began his descent down the darkened stairwell to the tunnel below. As he expected, the platform was empty. The wall clocks, along with everything else at the station, had stopped working long ago, but he knew he wouldn't have to wait long. The use of train timetables may have become a thing of the past, but there was still a schedule. Sure enough, he soon spotted the tip of the craft emerge from the mouth of the tunnel to his right. Within seconds, the rest of the wooden skiff floated into view, as did the tall man working an oar at the vessel's stern. Wearing a pair of tattered white pants that matched a mane of long white hair, the man's bare chest revealed a chiselled physique that seemed to defy his obviously very old age. Water sluiced against the stone walls of the channel as the boat's prow cut through its foam-coated surface, and he took a step backward as the vessel approached, so that it wouldn't splash his shoes. The skiff slowed to a stop in front of him. "Hi there," he said to the oarsman in as jovial a voice as he could muster. "I believe they told you I was coming. I'm your new trainee. I'm here to learn the trade from you, so you don't have to keep doing all these trips by yourself anymore. Hopefully, I can provide you some relief. They did tell you I was coming, yes?" The oarsman studied him, balancing effortlessly as the skiff rocked slightly in the water. "Sister Beatrice said you'd be expecting me," he added. Looking away, the oarsman peered down the shadowy tunnel ahead as he considered the other's words, as though trying to recollect the details of a conversation. After a short pause, he turned his attention back to the visitor and nodded. Yes, he stated succinctly. Gripping the oar tightly in his left hand, he gestured with his right as he dipped his head, almost with a flourish, for the other to board the creaking vessel. The newcomer smiled and stepped into the boat. Excellent. Just consider me your apprentice. With the nearly overnight disappearance of government-run services, drastic changes to the environment, particularly urban ones, were quick to follow. Without the continued operation of the underground pumps, the subway tunnels quickly flooded, transforming the track for electrically powering rail cars into a canal for waterborne vessels. Its walls were lined with the occasional torch, borne by a bronze sconce hammered into the rock in order to light the way, each casting a soft, ghostly glow that further emphasized the ominous black of the darkness beyond. Riding in the boat's bow, the apprentice felt a slight chill as they cruised within the cylindrical cavern enveloping them, its cold, stone surface the colour of pig iron and glistening with moisture such that the walls appeared to weep. They travelled for some distance in silence, and just as the rhythmic rocking of the boat started to make the apprentice's eyelids droop, the skiff sailed into the open space of a new station. He felt the oarsmen divert their course slightly to the left, and they floated over to the edge of the platform. Across the way, he saw a set of wide, concrete stairs like the one he himself had just ascended, which led up into the unknown above. At its base, two figures sat huddled together on the final two stairs, each with one arm wrapped around the other in a half embrace. Both were dressed in dark clothes and appeared to be cold, the man wearing a poncho and a long white scarf, the woman in a long slim coat with a hood drawn over her head. Just as he was thinking that it did not feel particularly cold here, a sudden, forceful wind whisked down the stairwell and around the station in a swirling squall. The gale-strength gusts buffeted the couple from every direction, nearly knocking them off the stairs more than once as they tried their best to shield their faces in each other's necks. After what felt like an exceedingly long time, the air gradually began to still. Hearing the winds whistling above in the unseen upper reaches of the stairwell, the apprentice realised this was just a temporary reprieve. He watched the oarsmen step onto the platform, then nod at the couple. Slowly, they rose and started making their way towards the boat. When they were about halfway across, a large, serpentine figure dashed out from the shadows and across the floor in their direction. Without hesitation, and as though he had done it many times before, the oarsman swung his oar out of the skiff, repositioned it in the air, and firmly gripping the shaft with two fists, swiftly brought the blade down on the creature, smoothly severing its head from its body. As the couple approached the vessel, the apprentice saw that he had been mistaken about their garments. The man's scarf and poncho were actually a stole draped over a chasuble, and the woman's coat with hood were actually a habit with veil. The priest and nun entered the boat and took a seat without a word. The oarsman followed and, using the oar, gave the skiff a quick push away from the platform. As they resumed their journey, their path almost immediately narrowed to a cylindrical channel once again. The apprentice moved to the back of the boat, so he could speak to the oarsman with discretion. "What is the meaning of this?" he whispered harshly, gesturing to their new passengers. "They are a man and woman of the cloth." "Yes," answered the oarsman. "So, what are they doing here?" "Those who have been adjudged carnal malefactors boarded that station." "Them?" the apprentice bellowed incredulously. "You're telling me those two were both overcome by lust?" "Perhaps the oarsman responded, not taking his eyes off the water. They ineptly chose a pious profession, the strict requirements of which they did not have the wherewithal to uphold. Possibly they were asked to do God's bidding together, were expected to trust, support, and rely on each other, were destined to grow close as they collectively worked in furtherance of their mutual goals of philanthropy and piety. Maybe they did not have the strength to suppress the feelings that would inevitably arise from such a relationship, based on the very human nature their God gave them. The apprentice scoffed. What you're saying is preposterous. Are you suggesting— Take heed, the oarsman interrupted. We approach the next station. As they neared the next mouth of the tunnel, they heard the icy rain hammering the platform well before they saw it. As their boat drifted up to it, the apprentice spotted a sole individual, sheltered on the floor beneath a piece of plywood that bridged the gap between two rusting turnstiles. As before, the oarsman manoeuvred the skiff with effortless skill until it settled against the edge of the platform. The torrential rain gradually dissipated until it was only a light patter, and the oarsman exited the vessel, then secured it with a rope to a large iron ring bolted to the floor. Suddenly, the apprentice heard a low, rumbling growl, and he turned his head to the left to identify the source of the noise. 10 paces from the turnstiles, a trio of wild dogs snarled and bared their teeth in a menacing show of aggression. The oarsman gestured for the sheltering individual to come forward, and the man scooted out from between the turnstiles and slowly stood. This time, the apprentice did not mistake the clerical clothing. The sacramental wine, if you will, the oarsman commanded, holding out his hand. The man reached into his cassock pocket with a trembling hand and extracted a silver flask. With an abashed look, he handed it over. Taking the flask, the oarsman pivoted and strode swiftly towards the dogs, unscrewing the top as he went. When he got to within 2 paces of the snarling beasts, he stopped, bent down, and slowly poured the wine onto the ground so that it formed a little pool. All 3 of the dogs stopped their snarling, stepped forward, and began lapping up the wine. He turned back to the shivering man and nodded, and the other followed him back to the boat. After they had pushed away from the platform, the apprentice once again joined the oarsman in the back of the skiff. "Another one?" he asked. "Yes." "And what is his alleged sin?" "Sin?" "Yes. Why did we pick him up?" "That station is where those overcome by gluttony board." "He's as thin as a rail. He doesn't look like much of a glutton to me," the apprentice remarked with a hint of derision. "Look at his hands. Do you see how they shake? Perhaps, amidst the increased demand for religious practices in the post-plague world, he was called upon to vastly increase the number of services of worship he performed." "Possibly. He was called upon to perform too many of these services. Services that included all the customary rituals. Rituals that required him to drink the sacramental wine. Maybe he performed these rituals hour after hour, day after day, until his mind was exhausted and his body was incapable of staving off its gradual addiction." As the apprentice opened his mouth to respond, he glanced back at the station they had just departed, and he saw that all 3 hounds now lay motionless on the floor. They appeared to have fallen on top of one another, such that their 3 heads had settled together in a single pile, their vacant eyes staring off into nothingness. For reasons he himself didn't understand, he remained silent until they reached their next stop. When the skiff arrived at the next station, a solitary figure stood at the end of the platform, his head held high. The apprentice was surprised to realise he recognised this new passenger, who was a clergyman of some renown. In no small part due to the man's limitless devotion to the cause, he had built one of the largest parishes in the area, and, consequently, had overseen the construction of the largest, most ornate cathedral in the city. A lone wolf sat, watching intently from the other end of the platform, but it did not approach. The oarsman signalled to the clergyman, and the man climbed into the boat. Once aboard, the oarsman explained to the apprentice that this was where those overcome by avarice boarded. In response to the apprentice's inquiry, the oarsman remarked, "Perhaps his veneration for the church was so great, and thus his dedication to its prosperity so complete, that he resolved to make his every effort subservient to this cause. Possibly he felt this warranted building one of the most attractive and inviting houses of worship that could be built, to attract and retain as many future parishioners as possible, in order to save as many souls as he could. Maybe this required perpetually demanding donations above what others could afford, and pillaging the parish's coffers in furtherance of this noble end." Having passed through these few stations from which they collected those poor souls who had been struck by the plague for mere sins of incontinence, they drifted along for some time. The oarsman, the apprentice, and the 4 pitiable passengers all rode in silence, which was only broken when they heard the muffled whoosh of fast-flowing water coming from somewhere off in the distance. The ominous sound was later followed by a foul odour that became more offensive with each passing moment. Then, no sooner had the oarsman instructed them all to brace themselves than they were briskly sucked into a large cavern that instantly overwhelmed the senses. For a brief moment, the apprentice observed an incredibly vast room that appeared to be some kind of hub, containing various tunnels and chambers connecting to the one they entered. Then, just as quickly, the image disappeared as he lost all perception of his surroundings. Evidently driven by unseen vortexes produced by this complex system of flooded spaces, powerful flows pushed and pulled their vessel about the cavern. The boat rose and fell and spun in powerful jerks, which, combined with the blinding sprays and deafening roars of the relentless waves, was completely disorienting. Despite his impaired visibility and hearing, the apprentice thought he could discern the shapes of people entangled with one another out amongst the raging waters, and he was sure he could hear angry shouts and agonized screams that seemed to be the sounds of war being waged. The apprentice and 4 passengers looked on helplessly as the oarsman's ancient muscles bulged while fighting the torrents battering their boat. Finally, after a harrowing ordeal of indefinable duration, their hardy craft was spun off into an adjacent, relatively calm, watery hellscape. The apprentice dried his eyes with his sleeve, and saw that they were drifting in a swamp of flotsam and fetid corpses in various stages of decomposition. The sudden stench of stagnant water and decaying flesh attacked his nose in an olfactory onslaught that was so noxious he nearly vomited. He covered his nose and mouth and peered around at the sight of bodies everywhere, some floating on the surface, some partially submerged, many of them bearing horrific scars or missing limbs. He glanced up at the oarsman, who wore a stoic expression as he focused on the path ahead, carefully steering the craft through the human wreckage that surrounded them. After what seemed an eternity, the way forward started to clear. In front of them, through the gradually dissipating mist, the apprentice spied a pair of skeletal steel towers rising from the dark water. Atop each, a small red beacon light flashed, and up ahead, a new arch-tunnel entrance became visible by their intermittent illumination. Moments later, their skiff silently passed between the structures, the only sound being that of the water haphazardly lapping against the tower's multiple struts, and finally exited the cavernous space to enter a new subway canal. As their minds and muscles relaxed, and they resumed their journey, the apprentice inquired about the hellish waterway they had just traversed. The oarsman would only say that it was where the wrathful would go to fight and die, and that they would go no further. As they approached the next station, the boat emerged from the tunnel with the benefit of far less light to guide their way than previously, a mere 2 torches on the platform itself remaining alight. In the space, reaching far above their heads and shrouded in darkness, the apprentice heard the beating of wings that he could not see, and he crouched in the skiff as he peered into the blackness in a futile attempt to identify its source. When the flapping sounds faded into the distance, he straightened again, and he took note of the man and woman standing on the platform in the dim, wavering torchlight. Other than their religious garb, there was nothing remarkable about them. They entered the boat, and the oarsman explained that this was where those who committed heresy boarded. In response to the apprentice's inquiry, the oarsman remarked, "Maybe their inability to reconcile their devotion to God and their devotion to the Church inevitably led them to reluctantly espouse heresy." When they rode into the next station, the apprentice was surprised to find a mounted guard patrolling its entrance. Instead of the usual stairwell, a very long ramp with a slight grade extended from some distant, unseen entry point down toward the platform. Near the bottom of the incline, a single male sentry astride a muscled brown stallion paced back and forth, and the apprentice realised that such guards were probably present at the top of the stairwells of the other stations with waiting passengers. The station was bigger than the first few they had visited, boasting what was once an informational booth, various shelves and spinner racks for books and periodicals, and multiple counters bearing now bare displays for unknown sundry items once sold by long-gone vendors. As the horse's head repeatedly disappeared behind these various structures, the mounted guard produced the eerie visage of a Centaurian patrol. The station was composed of 3 staggered levels that stepped down towards the canal, and on the last of these, the apprentice once again spotted a couple sitting huddled together. A small but continuous stream of water flowed down the ramp and merged with the puddles of rust that collected underneath the metallic racks to form a rivulet the colour of boiled blood, cascading down the stepped platform and past the couple's feet. The apprentice noted that this time the couple was a pair of male priests. Once the couple boarded the skiff and they were on their way again, The oarsman explained that this was where those guilty of every form of violence against neighbours, oneself, God, art, and nature all boarded. Those deemed blasphemers, sodomites, and usurers were all included. In response to the apprentice's inquiry, the oarsman remarked, "As we postulated earlier, with the priest and the nun, perhaps these two priests, desiring to serve the church, naively chose a calling with rules they could not hope to abide by. Possibly they were asked to do God's bidding together, and in so doing formed a relationship that could not be avoided under such circumstances. And, as with the others, maybe they were unable to suppress the feelings that would inevitably arise from such a relationship in view of the very human nature their God gave them." As their next destination started to come into view, motion caught his eye. The apprentice squinted in the dim torchlight of the canal, and he was surprised to discover that this new station was more automated than the previous ones. The stairwell comprised an escalator, and the platform, or at least a portion of it, appeared to be a travelator, though he could not fathom why this would be necessary. As more of the station became visible, it started to make a little more sense. Like the last one, this station was bigger than the first few they had visited, even accommodating several kiosks and a few small, abandoned storefronts. He found it curious that these people movers were still actively powered. As the oarsman expertly manoeuvred the tip of the skiff to kiss the rim of the platform, the true nature of the station came into full view, and the apprentice caught his breath. What he had thought were an escalator and travelator were actually a massive swarm of serpents slithering up and down the stairwell and spilling out over the stone surface below. A lone figure stood at the very edge of the platform, evidently trying his best to avoid them. His vestment revealed him to be a high-ranking clergyman. Not even waiting for a signal from the oarsman, the man hastily stepped into the skiff and took a seat next to the others. In contrast to when they departed from each of the previous stations, no one spoke as they rowed away from the platform. All remained quiet in the boat for several minutes, until, finally, the apprentice broke the silence with an uncharacteristic remark. "Wow, I am surprised you don't have some theory you want to proffer about this guy. You did not ask." The apprentice smirked. "What was that last station, anyway?" "That is where those who commit fraud board." "I see. Nothing you care to add to that?" The oarsman was quiet for a moment, as though carefully considering the question. Then, his expression unchanged, he simply stated, "It is plausible that the connection between the plague and divine moral judgment is a falsehood. It is also plausible that some of its most ardent advocates know it." "Better be careful," the apprentice warned. "You're starting to sound like a heretic." "How much further to go?" the apprentice asked after they had floated along the canal for some time. "We approach the final station." "Ah, well, in that case, how about if you let me take a turn? I'll need to learn how to actually navigate these waterways if I'm to relieve you of some of your burden." He held out his hand for the oar. The oarsman continued to row. "You are not here to relieve me." "Excuse me?" You are here to dispose of me." The apprentice stiffened. "What?" he guffawed. "The stated purpose of your visit is untrue." "That's ludicrous," the apprentice scoffed, his face quickly morphing into a forced expression of shock. "I don't know what you're talking about. I think, maybe, you've been spending too much time down here with the dying." "Perhaps, but that has no bearing on the nature of your visit." "I still don't know what you're talking about," the apprentice snapped bitterly, his face twisting as though he had just endured a most vicious affront. The oarsman sighed. "When the plague first appeared and the typical early victims were predominantly harlots and heroin addicts, easy targets of such a pestilence, the Church was happy to deem it a moral reckoning. But things have now progressed far beyond this, to the point where few are safe. Many members of the clergy are themselves succumbing or are in danger of doing so, and they intend to intervene to prevent that. No, you are not here to offer me relief from ferrying the dying across these waters. You are here to see that I join them." The oarsman stated it matter-of-factly, continuing to row. Then, in a voice that dropped to a whisper, he lamented, "If only it were so." Suddenly, his passenger's expression of indignation relaxed into a sardonic grin. "Well, Karen, it seems as though you're a bit cleverer than the authorities give you credit for." "Whose authorities?" "Ours. Everyone's," the apprentice snorted derisively. "Look, it doesn't matter. Frankly, it's just as well you discovered it now. We're near the end of our journey, and I have no desire to spend any more time in this wretched place." "I do not answer to your authorities." "Well, great. So I guess that makes you a blasphemer as well. Now I don't even have to feel so bad about this whole thing." The oarsman eyed him coolly, continuing to row. For several long moments the two simply locked eyes, until an insuppressible urge to cough caused the apprentice to look away. It was then, when he turned his head, that he first noticed their boat had already drifted past the final station. "Hey," he said in a jeering tone, his speech interrupted as he coughed into his palm. "You missed one. Why didn't we stop at that platform?" He turned to look at the oarsman, and, drawing his hand away from his face, saw that it contained some specks of blood. As he awaited an answer, the skiff drifted into a dark chamber, and he felt the temperature rise appreciably. Despite the feeble efforts of a few flickering torches mounted along its walls, the cavern was so dimly lit that little more than shadows and silhouettes were visible. Amid silence, distant moans and wails that were the unmistakable sounds of despondency and death began to arise from the indistinct shadows looming far ahead and echoed eerily off the stone walls around them. "We did not stop," the oarsman began, then stopped with the exertion of a final, strong stroke that sent the skiff coasting towards the final shore that was their destination, before he withdrew the blade of the oar from the water and banged it on the floor of the boat with a heavy thump. He leaned his chin on the handle and fixed the apprentice with a spine-tingling gaze before concluding, "Because that was the station where we would pick up one who has committed treachery, and that passenger is already on board." At that, the others in the skiff all turned in unison to gaze at the apprentice, as their eyes bore into him with the collective weight of their misery. Another violent cough racked his body. He tried in vain to stifle it with his sleeve, drops of blood spattering about his arm and face. As the boat slowly sailed closer and closer to its destination, the cries of countless unseen souls gradually grew louder and louder, rapidly multiplying in both number and intensity, their voices coalescing in a blood-curdling crescendo of deafening despair. The screams of physical agony and mental anguish from this chorus of the damned filled him with a terror-laden, paralyzing fear that overtook complete control of his body. At the same time, an overwhelming odour of decay and death also assaulted him, even worse than the corpse-infested swamp they had passed through earlier. A moment later, his eyes began to tear, both from the putrid stench attacking his senses from without, and the revelations attacking his sensibilities from within. He drew his arm away from his face, and through watery eyes observed that the cloth of his sleeve was soaked a dark red. The oarsman looked on, and then resumed rowing. Thank you for listening to The Oarsman, published as part of the Stygian Collection and presented by Black Screen Audio Productions. You can find links to Dave's channel and the Stygian Society in the description, and if you enjoyed this narration, then you know what to do. Until next time, take care. For now I'm off, and you should have a good 'un.